I'm thinking we should sell off the Cedar Rapids location. It's underperforming. My brother's voice echoed through the speakerphone, casual and dismissive, as if he were talking about tossing out a pair of old shoes rather than a facility that employed 37 people. I sat in my home office in Naperville, staring at the spreadsheet he'd emailed over that morning. The numbers told a different story than Josh was selling. Cedar Rapids wasn't underperforming. It just wasn't growing as rapidly as he wanted to show on his quarterly presentation. Growth at all costs, the Josh Harmon business strategy inherited directly from our father. Give me till the end of the week to look at the numbers, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Experience had taught me that showing any emotion, concern, anger, frustration, would immediately get me labeled as reactive or emotional. Josh had our father's playbook memorized. Sure, Ellie, do what you need to do. His tone dripped with indulgence. But the board meeting's on Tuesday, and I'm presenting my recommendation then. The call ended, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the familiar anger wash over me. A year ago, I would have sat in that board meeting, watching my brother present his half-baked plan, the token female Harmon with no real power at Harmon Industrial Supply, the company my grandfather had founded and my father had expanded. I would have offered my carefully researched counterpoints, only to be smiled at patronizingly by my brother and ignored by the board members, who saw me as nothing more than Frank Harmon's daughter, the less important one. But that was a year ago. I opened my email and sent a quick message to our CFO, copied to the head of our legal team and 3 key board members. Need to discuss Cedar Rapids situation before Tuesday's meeting, available tomorrow at 9 a.m. The responses came back within minutes. All would attend. I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of Pinot Noir. Through the window, I could see the last light of day fading over my backyard. The property wasn't large or flashy, nothing like the lakefront mansion my brother had purchased after Dad gave him 60% of the company shares and the CEO position. It's nothing personal, Eleanor, Dad had said from his hospital bed 6 weeks before he died. Josh has been groomed for this his whole life. You've always been more sensitive. This business requires a certain toughness. I hadn't argued. I hadn't cried. I'd kissed his forehead, told him I understood, and walked out of the room with my back straight. Then I'd called Martin Glazer, our largest investor, and asked him to lunch. That lunch happened 2 days later, and it was the first real move in a game I hadn't even realized I was playing until that moment. The thing is, Marty, I'd said over salmon at a quiet restaurant in Evanston, Josh doesn't know what he doesn't know. Dad protected him, covered for him. But without Dad, Martin had nodded slowly. He'd worked with my father for 30 years. He knew. What are you proposing, Eleanor? Nothing yet. Just asking you to watch, and when the time comes, if the time comes, to remember this conversation. I wasn't planning a coup then. Not really. Maybe I was just looking for validation from someone who knew the business as well as Dad had, someone who might see me as more than an afterthought. But seeds had been planted, and over the months that followed, as I watched Josh fumble decision after decision while brushing off my attempts to help, those seeds took root. Now, a year later, Josh had given me exactly what I needed. Cedar Rapids wasn't just any location. It was where our grandfather had started the company. It was profitable, stable, employed loyal workers who'd been with us for decades. Selling it made no financial sense. It made emotional sense to Josh, who'd always been jealous of the special connection I had with our grandfather in the years before he died. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana, our legal counsel. Got the files you requested. Meeting prep for tomorrow? Perfect, I texted back. Let's talk at 8. I took another sip of wine and felt a calm certainty settle over me. Tomorrow's meeting would be the first domino. By the time the board meeting rolled around on Tuesday, Josh wouldn't know what hit him. I woke at 5 a.m. the next morning, my mind already racing with the day ahead. After a quick run through my neighborhood, the same 3-mile loop I'd been doing since I moved to Naperville 6 years ago, I showered and dressed with particular care. Not flashy, not trying too hard, but polished, professional. The navy pantsuit I'd had tailored last month paired with a simple white blouse and my grandmother's pearl earrings. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman my father had never quite managed to see. I was 34, with his dark eyes and my mother's determined chin. I had an MBA from Northwestern, 8 years of experience in our family business, and knowledge of our operations that Josh, with his corner office and inflated title, had never bothered to acquire. By 7:30, I was at the office, reviewing my presentation one last time with Diana. "This is solid, Eleanor," she said, her glasses perched on top of her head as she skimmed the final slides. "The numbers speak for themselves." "Numbers didn't speak loudly enough for my father," I said, then immediately regretted the bitterness in my tone. Diana gave me a measured look. "Your father built a successful business, but he had blind spots, big ones." She closed my laptop gently. "This isn't about him anymore. This is about the future of Harmon Industrial." She was right, of course. This wasn't about settling old scores, even if part of me couldn't help but view it that way. This was about protecting what my grandfather had built, what hundreds of employees depended on, what I'd dedicated my adult life to nurturing. At precisely 9 a.m., I walked into the conference room where Martin, Bernard, and Richard, 3 of our most influential board members, were waiting along with Diana and Terry, our CFO. I didn't rush through pleasantries or jump straight to my agenda. I took my time, asked about Bernard's new granddaughter, inquired after Richard's wife who'd been ill. These men had known me since I was a child visiting my grandfather's office, but they'd rarely seen me as a leader. Today, that would change. "So to summarize," I said at 9:47 a.m., after methodically walking them through my analysis, Cedar Rapids has been consistently profitable for 17 years, provides specialized manufacturing capabilities we can't replicate elsewhere without significant investment, and the property value alone has appreciated 32% since we purchased it. I clicked to the next slide. These are projections if we invest the $400,000 Josh wants to use for the new Chicago expansion into upgrading Cedar Rapids instead. The room was silent as they digested the numbers. Martin Glazer removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "And Josh wants to sell this facility. Why exactly?" Diana, our counsel, exchanged glances with me. "The official reason in his proposal is streamlining operations," she said. "But there's no operational justification in selling this particular facility." "It's personal," Martin finished for her. "It's his grandfather's legacy." I didn't need to say anything. The 3 board members in the room had known my grandfather. They'd watched Josh and me grow up. They knew. "There's something else," Terry added, sliding a folder across the table. "The Chicago expansion proposal. The numbers don't add up. The property Josh is looking at is overvalued, and the market analysis is optimistic at best." "Who did this analysis?" asked Bernard, his bushy eyebrows drawing together as he flipped through the pages. "Westlake Consulting," I said quietly. The room went still. Westlake was run by Josh's college roommate, a connection nobody in this room had forgotten. It wasn't the first time Josh had directed company business to his friends, but it was perhaps the most flagrant example. "I see," Martin said, closing the folder. "And what is your recommendation, Eleanor?" I straightened in my chair. "We vote against the Cedar Rapids sale at Tuesday's meeting. We request an independent analysis of the Chicago expansion, and we begin discussing a restructuring of the executive team." Bernard raised an eyebrow. "Restructuring?" "Josh has made 3 major missteps in the past 8 months, Diana interjected, opening another folder. "The Madison acquisition that fell through after we'd spent $200,000 on due diligence. The inventory management system that had to be scrapped halfway through implementation. And now this. All of which Eleanor advised against," Martin noted. I met his eyes across the table. "I'd like to propose a vote of no confidence at the next shareholders meeting. I've been speaking with several of our investors. They're concerned." "As well they should be," Bernard muttered. "And if the vote passes?" Martin asked, though the slight upturn of his lips told me he already knew my answer. "Then I'd like to be considered for the CEO position," I said calmly. "I've prepared a strategic plan for the next 3 years. Diana can distribute copies now." As the folders were passed around, I felt a strange lightness. No heated argument. No dramatic confrontation. Just facts, consequences, and the slow, inexorable turning of the tide. Martin flipped through my proposal, nodding slightly. "We'll need to discuss this further, of course, but I think we have what we need for Tuesday's meeting." As everyone filed out, Martin hung back. "Your father was wrong about you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You're not too sensitive for this business. You're exactly what this business needs." I smiled. "Thank you, Marty. That means a lot." He paused at the door. "Josh won't go down without a fight, you know. I'm counting on it," I replied. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I rehearsed my talking points, reviewed every number until I could recite them from memory, and even carved out time for a long overdue dinner with my mother, who lived in a condo in nearby Wheaton. Mom had never been directly involved in the business, but she'd been married to my father for 38 years before he died. She knew his strengths and his weaknesses better than anyone. "Your father always saw himself in Josh," she said as we shared dessert. "Not because Josh was like him, but because Frank wanted him to be. It was easier than seeing Josh for who he really was." "And me?" I couldn't help asking. "Who did he see in me?" Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "He saw your grandfather, and that scared him because your grandfather would never have built the business the way Frank did. Too cautious, too principled." She smiled sadly. "Frank always thought he knew better than his own father." "But he was wrong," I said quietly. "About many things," she agreed, "but especially about you." By Tuesday morning, I felt centered in a way I hadn't for years. This wasn't just about claiming what should have been mine. It was about honoring my grandfather's vision, about steering the company back to the principles that had made it strong in the first place. The board meeting began at 10 a.m. sharp. Josh arrived late, as usual, striding in with the confidence of a man who'd never had to earn his position. He nodded to me perfunctorily before taking his seat at the head of the table. The first hour passed with routine updates and reports. Then, Josh moved to his Cedar Rapids proposal, presenting it with his usual mix of charm and selective facts. Bottom line, he concluded, Cedar Rapids is a drag on our growth metrics. It's never going to be a star performer. We sell now, we can use that capital for expansion into markets that actually have potential. I waited for the board chair to acknowledge me, then stood with my presentation queued up. For the next 20 minutes, I methodically dismantled Josh's proposal, point by point, never raising my voice, never showing a hint of the satisfaction I felt as I watched his expression shift from confidence to confusion to barely contained fury. When the vote came, 7-2 against the sale, Josh's face had flushed red, his jaw clenching in that familiar way I remembered from childhood tantrums. "This is bullshit," he'd hissed at me in the hallway afterward. "What did you do? What deals did you make?" I'd looked at him calmly. "I did my job, Josh. I protected our company from a bad decision." "Our company? Dad gave me this company." "Dad gave you shares in this company," I corrected him. "And leadership is earned, not given." He jabbed a finger toward my face. "This isn't over, Ellie. Not by a long shot." I'd believed him. Josh had always been vindictive, but I'd also been preparing for this moment for a year, and I was far more patient than he'd ever given me credit for. Over the next 2 months, Josh made exactly the mistakes I'd anticipated. He tried to push through decisions without proper board approval. He began excluding me from key meetings. He even attempted to reassign some of my direct reports to other departments. Each move was documented, reported, and added to the growing file Diana was building. The independent analysis of the Chicago expansion came back with a valuation 40% lower than Josh's proposal had claimed. An audit of the Madison acquisition revealed that Josh had bypassed key due diligence steps in his rush to close the deal. All the while, continued meeting with investors. Not dramatically, not obviously, just lunch here, coffee there. Listening to their concerns, sharing my vision for the company's future, building allies. One evening, I found myself sitting across from Evelyn Pierce, a 70-year-old investor who'd been one of my father's closest friends. "Frank always said Josh was a natural leader," she said, stirring her tea. "But between you and me, Eleanor, I never saw it. What I did see was a boy who was told he was special so often that he believed it without question." "And what do you see now?" I asked. Evelyn's gaze was sharp, assessing. "I see a company at a crossroads, and I see someone who might be able to guide it in the right direction." She set down her spoon. "Your father was my friend, but he wasn't always right, especially about his children." That night, I added Evelyn's proxy votes to my tally. We were at 53% support for the no confidence vote. By the time I'd finished my calls the following week, we were at 58%. Meanwhile, Josh was burning bridges as quickly as I was building them. He snapped at longtime employees, missed meetings with key clients, and blamed everyone but himself for the mounting problems. His face grew haggard, his temper shorter. He'd even stopped bringing his wife to company functions after she'd gotten into an argument with one of our major clients' spouses. 3 months after the Cedar Rapids showdown, I called Martin. "It's time," I said simply. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for the following week. Josh seemed confident, almost smug, as he took his place at the head of the table. He'd been working the phones too, rallying the investors he thought were loyal to him, mostly older men who'd been friends with our father. What he didn't know was how many of those men had lost faith in him over the past year. What he didn't know was how many smaller shareholders, the ones he'd never bothered to court, had pledged their support to me. The vote of no confidence passed 58% to 42%. The vote to install me as CEO passed by the same margin. Josh stood up so abruptly that his chair crashed to the floor behind him. "This is a fucking coup," he snarled, looking around the room wildly. "My sister has been undermining me from day one. Dad knew she wasn't right for this. Dad knew." "Josh," Martin interrupted firmly, "that's enough. The vote is final." My brother turned to me, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You planned this, all of it, from the beginning." I met his gaze steadily. "No, Josh, you did this yourself. Every hasty decision, every ignored warning, every time you dismissed expertise because it came from me or anyone else you thought was beneath you." "This isn't over," he hissed for the second time, but we both knew it was. The transition wasn't smooth. Josh threatened to sell his shares, to start a competing business, to sue me personally. But the shareholder agreement our father had put in place prevented him from selling his shares outside the family for 5 years after Dad's death. And Josh needed money. His lavish lifestyle and poor investment choices had left him with far less cushion than anyone realized. In the end, we reached a settlement. Josh would remain on as VP of Business Development, a title with little actual power. He would keep his board seat, and I would buy 20% of his shares at market value, giving me controlling interest in the company. He had no choice but to accept. The morning of my first day as CEO, I arrived at the office an hour early. The building was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows through the lobby. I took the elevator to the executive floor, my heels clicking on the polished floor, as I walked down the hallway to what was now my office. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. The corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the heavy wooden desk that had been my father's. The credenza where he'd always kept a photograph of Josh and me as children. Josh front and center, me slightly to the side, partially cropped out of the frame. That photograph was gone now, already packed away by the facilities team who'd cleared the office for its new occupant. I set down my bag and walked to the windows, looking out over the small industrial park where Harmon Industrial Supply had been headquartered for the past 15 years. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. My assistant, Denise, stood there with a coffee and a tentative smile. "Good morning, Miss Harmon. I mean Eleanor." She set the coffee on the desk. "Your 9 a.m. meeting is confirmed, and I've updated your calendar with the production report review at 11. "Thank you, Denise," I said, taking a seat behind the desk, my desk now. "Is Josh in yet?" "No, ma'am, but he did email to confirm he'll be at the management meeting at 2. I nodded, unsurprised. Josh was probably nursing both a hangover and his wounded pride this morning. The day passed in a blur of meetings, decisions, and small adjustments to my new role. By the time the management meeting rolled around at 2 p.m., I felt settled, focused, ready to begin implementing the changes I'd been planning for months. Josh arrived exactly on time, sliding into a seat as far from me as the conference table allowed. His face was carefully blank, his posture rigid. The other executives glanced between us uncomfortably. I began the meeting by outlining my vision for the company's next chapter, a return to the quality-focused, employee-centered values my grandfather had established, coupled with strategic growth in our strongest markets. Josh stared at a point just over my shoulder the entire time, his expression unreadable. When it came time for department updates, he delivered his prepared remarks in a monotone, making minimal eye contact and offering no elaboration beyond what was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Josh," I said when he finished. "I'd like you to work with Terry on exploring potential partnerships in the Minnesota market. You've got good connections there that could be valuable. A small olive branch. Not forgiveness, but a path forward." He gave a curt nod and said nothing more. Later that day, I moved my personal belongings into the CEO's office. I placed my grandfather's first business ledger on the shelf, alongside a photo of him and me at the Cedar Rapids facility when I was 12. I didn't put up any photos of my father. That wound was still too fresh, too complex. As I settled into the leather chair behind the desk, my phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "How does it feel?" I looked around the office, now my office, and tried to name the emotion. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction, exactly. It was something quieter, more foundational. "Like finally being seen?" I texted back. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, Harmon Industrial Supply's stock had risen 12%. The Cedar Rapids facility, with its modest investment in new equipment, was now our most efficient location. The toxic managers Josh had promoted were gone, replaced by a more diverse, collaborative team. And Josh himself had gradually shifted from open hostility to grudging participation in his new role. We still weren't speaking outside of work contexts. Family holidays had become an exercise in careful scheduling. Josh and his wife would visit our mother for Christmas Eve. I would go on Christmas Day. It wasn't ideal, but it was workable. We had both accepted that some bridges, once burned, take years to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. What surprised me most was how quickly the company culture began to shift once I took the helm. Employees who had kept their heads down during Josh's tenure began offering ideas, taking initiative. The fear-based management style my brother had inherited from our father gave way to something more collaborative, more innovative. "People actually want to come to work now," Denise commented one day. "It's like everyone can finally breathe." I hadn't realized how stifled the company had become until I saw it begin to thrive again. On the anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave alone. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I approached the headstone. "You were wrong about me, Dad," I said quietly to the cold marble. "And you were wrong about Josh. You set us both up to fail. Him through entitlement, me through dismissal." A cool breeze stirred the trees above. "But I fixed it," I continued. "Not out of spite, not even for justice, but because it was the right thing for the company, for Grandpa's legacy, for all the people who depend on us getting this right." I placed a small stone on top of his headstone, an old tradition my grandfather had taught me. "I hope you can see that now," I said, and turned to walk away. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my home. Nothing flashy, just good food and better company. Martin and his wife, Diana and her partner, a few other close allies who'd become friends through this journey. Josh wasn't there. That bridge, if ever to be rebuilt, was a project for another day. As we sat around my dining table, glasses raised in a toast to the company's latest success, I felt a deep sense of rightness settle in my chest. Not because I'd won, not because my brother had lost, but because after a lifetime of being overlooked, I was finally exactly where I was meant to be. And no one, not my father's ghost, not my brother's resentment, not my own lingering doubts, could take that away from me.